Ian Brzezinski, thank you very much for joining us today to talk about all things related to NATO, US relations, Russia, Ukraine, and so forth. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, Iya, Happy New Year, and it's great to see you again, and thank you for bringing me on.
Thank you very much. Let's start from the US NATO relations. President Trump has made multiple statements in the past, as well as during the election campaign. And he also, lately, he's been proposing or pushing this idea for the NATO allies to spend 5% of their GDP on their own defense. What do you think about this idea?
I think it's actually a sound recommendation. We face a much more volatile and dangerous world. That's one of the realities he's unfortunately inheriting from the Biden administration. The world's become a more lethal place. We have a high intensity war in Ukraine that's unresolved. We have the spreading of violence across the Middle East. The Houthis can still fire missiles against the ships in traversing the Red Sea. We have increasing Chinese predatory conduct, aggression in the Indo-Pacific, not to mention a plethora of other threats. So we do need to spend more. I mean, think about this. During World War II, we spent, I think, roughly 37% of GDP to defeat the Axis. During the Korean War, it was 14% of GDP. During the Vietnam War, it was 9%. And one can make the case that was a less complex, less volatile uh, context, even while we had the Cold War. Uh, so 2% today is not going to cut it.
No.
And 5% to me sounds like a very reasonable figure if we're really going to, as an alliance, develop the deterrent posture, the defense capabilities necessary to protect and promote our interests.
Do you think it's
We're no longer
realistic?
talking about one theater. We're talking about three theaters that are now interconnected and on the cusp of metastasizing into something that could be a really global conflagration. And we're not prepared.
We're not prepared. Do you think it's realistic to ask the allies to push it up to 5%?
I started off the question with, what do we need to do? And I think that's what we need to do. And the transatlantic community is a community that has a GDP of $54 trillion. So we have the wealth. Uh, but this is a world of
Be the
real
will, right?
decisions, and there has to be sacrifices made. And I would argue that that sacrifice is worth it to prevent what could be a devastating, catastrophic set of conflagrations.
Mm.
It'll be far cheaper to spend that 5% now than to pay the human and financial costs of a broader war.
Yeah. Europeans and European side of NATO, I should say, was prepared, it seems like, at least based on some of the statements. The Secretary General Rutte has been also very proactively talking about strengthening NATO's abilities. Where do you see NATO in the war in Ukraine, and bringing the war to some sort of end point? Um, do you think NATO has a bigger role now moving forward?
This is a tragic war. It's a war that's cost over 1 million combatant casualties on both Russian and Ukrainian. It's displaced millions. It's destroying a democracy in the heart of Europe. That's Ukraine. Uh, and we have an interest in bringing this war to a swift and just end, and in a way that ensures enduring stability, at least military stability, on a continent that probably is going to have to face long-term confrontation with Russia. And if we want to achieve those objectives, the most effective way to do that is through NATO, with NATO playing a leadership role in the support of Ukraine and the securing of Ukraine.
Mhm.
And for me, the most effective way to do that is to extend NATO membership to Ukraine, including its Article 5 security guarantee. And that, in the current circumstance, would involve some sort of deterrent force that would deploy to Ukraine to, at a minimum, secure the territory or help Ukraine secure the territory it currently controls.
Mm.
That, I think, is the most effective way to bring this war to an end and then also to set a foundation for military stability in the aftermath.
Yeah. Do you think that's possible? How are you proposing to do that?
I mean,
NATO allies
it is
minus the
possible.
United States?
No, it would have to involve the United States because a deterrent force without the United States will lack the credibility and probably the capacity
Mm.
necessary to be truly an effective deterrent to Russian aggression and a defense against any kind of Russian provocation or attack.
Okay, then let's talk about the incoming Trump administration. To Do you think it would be possible to convince President Trump, who's been very skeptical about NATO, Ukraine's membership in NATO, to take some of those steps that you're just proposed?
How Trump manages this conflict, how he brings it to its next phase, so to speak, hopefully one which is an end of the fighting on just and stable terms, will define the credibility of his peace through strength strategy. If he does what he has said he would do during the campaign, that would be Chamberlain-like concessions that would strip Ukraine of its sovereignty and security and probably lead to a wider war. Trump doesn't want that, but he still has to be convinced. And so I would say there are three arguments you would make the case, three arguments and actions that the Europeans need to make to Trump. One is to leverage his fear of a wider war that would suck in U.S. involvement. That's the one thing Trump fears. He doesn't want to have on his watch another war, another endless war that drags in American troops.
Right.
He, when he comes to the Resolute desk on January 20th, he's going to be sitting before a world that, as we have talked about, has three major contingencies: hot war in Ukraine, high intensity conflict there, spreading violence in the Middle East, and increasing Russian, Chinese provocation and aggression in the Middle East. They are at risk. They are all interlinked. They are at risk of metastasizing into what could be a global war, really catastrophic proportion. To prevent that, there is a prioritization, and it is Ukraine first. Ending the war in Ukraine on stable and just terms is the most effective way to prevent that escalation. So that's the first point I would make to Trump. Second point would be that, if he wants his peace through strength national security strategy to have credibility, it's going to be defined by what he does on Ukraine. And if he makes concessions to the Russians that are extreme, that are strategically unstable, that reward aggression, peace through strength will be associated less with Churchill and more with Chamberlain. He doesn't want that. We don't want that. And the third thing is an action item, and it falls, I think, on the Europeans. And there's actually some legitimacy to it. They need to stand up now and say that they are willing to put together a deterrent force. I don't know if it's 50,000, 75,000 personnel, but a sufficient force that will be willing to go in and deploy into Ukraine to provide that deterrent capacity. And the request they would make to Trump is that they would want some American dimension in that. So this would be a deterrent force that they would propose that would be 80 to 90% European with an American dimension, probably a command and control arrangement or capacities like a headquarters, maybe some air assets and missile defense assets that we already have in Europe.
Yeah.
That would be the kind of burden sharing that Trump would expect. That's the kind of action that could help bring this war to an appropriate end. And that is something that Trump, I think, would find appealing because it would end the war, it would validate his peace through strength strategy, and it would demonstrate that he has led the Europeans to carry their share of the burden that he's been demanding for so long.
Yeah. What do you make of General Kellogg's statement that his goal is to end the war in 100 days from the inauguration? And General Kellogg, of course, is the special representative that President Trump appointed with Russia and Ukraine.
Well,
Is that realistic?
it's possible. 100 days is a reasonable target. For me, what's important about that statement and other statements that the president-elect has made. I mean, so we've gone from solving this war in 1 day to 100 days. Trump, in some statements, has described Russia as an adversary. Trump has even said he's, in 1 or 2 statements that he's not going to abandon Ukraine. So this is a shift from what he said during his campaign, where he said we had no interest in this, that this war was caused by Ukraine. You know, these are slivers in a boatload of statements that have been troubling, but it's a step in the right direction and probably reflects the fact that Trump now recognizes he is going to be the president on January 20th, and this is going to be his responsibility. So there's a change in perspective that comes with that, with an inauguration. And so maybe they're hopefully taking a more constructive, strategic approach to this conflict. So I have my fingers crossed. I'm not willing to bet on it, but those are some positive signs.
What do you think is going to happen to a Ramstein format under President Trump?
My initial gut will be that the Trump administration will be happy to have the Europeans lead it, which I think would be a mistake, because without American leadership, you lose a lot of that momentum. You lose a lot of the pressure that's necessary to get the Europeans to continue providing the level of assistance they've had, and that would be necessary to increase those levels of assistance. Leadership counts, and American leadership counts. And when we're not there, the situation is likely to be worse.
What do you think about the prospect of U.S. somehow establishing some sort of sovereignty or control over Greenland, which has been, of course, a major topic of conversations in transatlantic relations recently?
One, I don't think it's going to happen, because I don't think the Greenlanders want to become the 51st, 52nd state, with just like the Canadians. Two, making these kind of statements is incredibly provocative and unhelpful in our relationship with the Europeans. Third, these kind of statements actually kind of are similar to statements being made by Putin and by Xi about territorial acquisition, which I think is basically gives them more momentum. That's a recipe for a more unstable world. It doesn't resonate well with any of our other European allies. And it's stunning to me because we have a lot at stake in Greenland, both in real time and potentially. In real time, we have an important defense installation there that's basically our eyes over the Arctic that enables us to guard against Russian missile attacks. We should be trying to preserve that. There's immense resources in Greenland that we would want to be able to access. When you create this kind of tension, it doesn't help in that regard. Greenland's an important location because it was placed in the Atlantic and the Arctic. As the ice melts in that region, there's going to be more transport there. It's going to be a potentially important node in that regard. And
that's why President Trump is proposing what he's proposing, because
well, that's what he's claiming, but he's disrupting our ability to kind of get what he wants, because the Danes have traditionally always been very forthcoming to our requests. Yeah. They're eager for American investment. They want to cooperate. They want to do more with us defense-wise. Let's leverage that reality rather than trying to intimidate them or force them into submitting to demands. Let's take an approach that's more cooperative and collaborative, and we'll get exactly what we want and what we need.
Yeah. We're certainly entering a very interesting 4 years of international relations. So thank you very much for your time, Ian, and for making some sense for us on some of these events.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Good to see you.